The gavel came down like a gunshot, and Phineas Wallace watched a guilty man walk free into the Texas sunlight, while an innocent one sat chained beside a stove that would never warm him again. It was the spring of 1875, in the dusty courthouse of Larkspur, Texas, a cattle town wedged between the Brazos River and a stretch of limestone hills that turned gold at dusk. Phineas was 22 years old that year, a lean ranch hand with sun-cracked hands and a quiet way about him, and he had ridden into town that morning believing that justice was a thing that simply happened, the way rain happened, or winter. He learned otherwise before the noon bell rang. The man walking free was Silas Marrow, a cattle broker with slicked hair and a smile like a folded knife, who owned half the saloons on Main Street and had his fingers, it was whispered, in every land deal for 30 miles. The man who remained behind, wrists bound in iron, was Samuel Graves, Nora's father, the owner of a modest but proud spread along Cottonwood Creek, a man who had never raised his voice at a living soul except to call cattle home. Jedediah Cole, a wealthy landowner who had been trying to buy up the water rights along the creek, had been found shot dead behind his own barn 3 weeks before. Silas Marrow had stood to gain the most from Cole's death, for Cole had refused to sell his portion of the water rights to Marrow, and Marrow had been seen arguing with him the very night he died. But when the trial came, a witness swore under oath that he had seen Samuel Graves near Cole's property that same night, angry over an old boundary dispute, and Judge Elias Thorne, a heavy man with tired eyes and a taste for expensive whiskey, chose to believe the witness over the evidence of a broken belt buckle found near the body, a buckle that matched none but Silas Marrow's own silver-plated set. Phineas had seen that buckle. He had held it in his own hands the week before, when Marrow, drunk in the Cottonwood saloon, had bragged that Cole would soon learn who truly owned the water in this country. He had seen Marrow's hand shake as he reached for that very buckle after it slipped from his belt loop. He had told the sheriff. He had told anyone who would listen. But Phineas Wallace was only a hired hand of 22, with no name and no money, and Silas Marrow had both, along with a friendship with Judge Thorne that ran deeper than anyone in Larkspur dared say aloud. The court finds insufficient evidence to hold Mr. Marrow, Judge Thorne had intoned, and the room had rustled with a strange, uneasy relief, the kind that comes when powerful men remind a town who truly rules it. Marrow had risen, straightened his coat, and walked past Samuel Graves without so much as a glance, as though the man in chains were no more than a fence post. It was Nora Graves who broke the silence that followed. She had been sitting in the front row, 18 years old, in a faded blue dress her mother had sewn before she died of fever 2 winters past, and when her father was led toward the second half of the docket, to stand trial for the very murder Marrow had just been excused of, she rose from her seat with a cry that Phineas would hear in his sleep for the next 10 years. "That is not justice," she shouted, her voice cracking across the courtroom like a whip. "You are letting a murderer walk while you hang my father for a crime he never committed." The judge banged his gavel and ordered her removed, and 2 deputies took her by the arms, though she did not struggle so much as she simply stood, staring at her father as though trying to memorize his face before the world took him from her. Phineas Wallace, standing at the back of the room with his hat in his hands, felt something harden in his chest that day, something that would not soften again until a decade had passed. He was in love with Nora Graves before he ever admitted it to himself, and he loved her more in that moment of her fury than he ever had watching her laugh beside the creek or sing while she hung the wash. He loved her for refusing to be silent, even when silence would have been so much safer. Samuel Graves was convicted 3 days later on the word of a single paid witness and circumstantial evidence that would not have held in any honest court. Judge Thorne sentenced him to 15 years at the state penitentiary in Huntsville, sparing him the noose only, some said, because hanging an innocent man too plainly might have stirred the very questions Marrow wished buried forever. Phineas rode out to the Graves ranch the night after the sentencing, his heart hammering with a resolve he barely understood himself. He found Nora sitting alone on the porch steps, her knees drawn up to her chest, staring at nothing. "They took him," she said without looking up, "and nobody in that whole town lifted a hand to stop it." "I tried," Phineas said. "I told the sheriff what I saw. He said a hired hand's word was worth less than a rancher's, and mine was worth less still against a man like Marrow." "Then what good is trying?" Nora said bitterly, and Phineas sat down beside her on the step, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "I do not know," he admitted, "but I know I am not finished trying. I saw that buckle, Nora. I know what I saw. One day I am going to make sure the whole territory knows it too." She looked at him then, her eyes red-rimmed but fierce. "You would do that for my father." "For your father," Phineas said, and then, because the truth was pressing so hard against his ribs he could not hold it back any longer, "and for you." Nora did not answer him that night, not with words. She only reached over and took his hand, and they sat together on the porch until the moon rose high over Cottonwood Creek, two young people bound by an injustice neither of them yet understood how to undo. The following months were a slow unraveling of everything the Graves family had built. Silas Marrow, free and emboldened, moved quickly to buy up the debts Samuel Graves had taken on during a hard winter 2 years before, debts the bank was only too willing to sell at a discount to a man of Marrow's standing. Within 4 months, the ranch along Cottonwood Creek belonged to Silas Marrow, and Nora Graves was left with little more than the clothes on her back and a small trunk of her mother's belongings. Phineas found her work as best he could, first with a rancher 3 miles north who needed help with the branding, and did not mind that his hired hand's sweetheart lived in the bunkhouse loft until she found her feet. And then, when word of her situation reached the town seamstress, a woman named Mrs. Colby who had known Nora's mother, Nora was taken in properly and taught the trade of dressmaking, a skill that would keep bread on her table for years to come. Phineas himself could not stay in Larkspur. Marrow had grown suspicious of the young ranch hand who had spoken against him, and there were whispers that accidents befell men who crossed Silas Marrow, accidents involving skittish horses or midnight fires. Phineas knew that if he wished to help Nora and her father, he would need more than his word. He would need standing and proof, and the kind of authority that could not be dismissed with a wave of a rich man's hand. "I am going to join the Texas Rangers," he told Nora one evening in early autumn, as she sat stitching by lamplight in the small room behind Mrs. Colby's shop. "There is a company forming out of Fort Griffin. They need riders who know the country and are not afraid of hard travel." Nora's needle stilled. "You are leaving." "I am leaving so that one day I can come back with the power to do something," Phineas said. "A ranger's word carries weight, Nora. A hired hand's does not. I mean to earn that weight however long it takes." "And how long will it take?" Phineas did not have an answer for her, not an honest one, and so he gave her the only promise he could keep. "As long as it takes." "I am not asking you to wait on me, Nora Graves. I am only asking you to believe that I have not forgotten your father, or you, no matter how far I ride." Nora set down her sewing and crossed the small room to him, and though neither of them spoke of love that night, not directly, she pressed a folded handkerchief into his hand, one she had embroidered herself with a small blue larkspur flower in the corner, the same flower for which the town was named. "Come back," she said simply. "Whenever you can. I do not care how many years it takes, Phineas Wallace. Just come back." He rode out of Larkspur 3 days later with that handkerchief tucked inside his shirt, close to his heart, and he did not know then that it would be nearly 10 years before he could ride back into that town with the truth finally in his hands. The years that followed tested every ounce of patience Phineas Wallace possessed. He rode with the Texas Rangers out of Fort Griffin for the better part of 4 years, chasing rustlers and outlaws across the Panhandle, learning the hard trade of tracking men who did not wish to be found. He earned a reputation among his fellow rangers as a man who never let a trail go cold, and though his captain, a weathered veteran named Emmett Doyle, often teased him for his stubbornness, it was that very stubbornness that kept him alive through gunfights along the Red River and a hard winter chasing horse thieves into the Llano Estacado. But no matter where his duties took him, Phineas never stopped gathering pieces of the puzzle that had stolen Samuel Graves's freedom. He wrote letters, careful and discreet, to men who had once worked for Silas Marrow, asking after old grudges and unpaid wages, for a man who cheats his enemies rarely treats his hired hands any better, and bitter men often talk. He learned of a ranch hand named Cassius Boone, who had worked for Marrow the very year Jedediah Cole was killed, a man who had been paid an unusual sum shortly after the trial, and then vanished west toward New Mexico territory. Phineas tracked rumors of Boone for 2 full years without success, chasing whispers through Tascosa and Mesilla and a dozen dusty towns in between, each lead going cold before he could close his hand around it. All the while he wrote to Nora Graves. His letters were plain, for he was not a man given to flowery words, but they were honest, and they came steadily, first every few months and then, as the years wore on and the postal routes improved with the growth of the railroads, nearly every month. He told her of the country he rode through, of the herds of longhorns stretching to the horizon, of the Comanche families he had come to respect for their knowledge of the land, even as the government pushed them onto smaller and smaller reservations. An injustice he privately thought no better than the one done to her own father. He told her of Diego Reyes, a vaquero he had befriended who had taught him to read cattle brands better than any book could teach, and who had himself lost family land to a crooked survey years before, another quiet theft dressed up in legal paper. Nora wrote back faithfully, her letters full of small details that Phineas came to treasure more than any gold he might have found prospecting. The new dress pattern Mrs. Colby had taught her, the wildflowers blooming early one spring, the ache she still felt every time she passed the old road that led to what had once been her family's ranch, now grazed by Marrow's cattle. She wrote, too, of her father, who endured his years at Huntsville with a quiet dignity that broke her heart every time she made the long journey to visit him, a journey she saved for months to afford. "He asks after you," she wrote in one letter that Phineas kept folded in his saddlebag for years afterward. "He says a man who keeps his word across so many miles and so many years is a man worth waiting for. I did not tell him I already knew that." It was in the 6th year, in 1881, that Samuel Graves died within the walls of the penitentiary, taken by a fever that swept through the crowded cell blocks that winter. Phineas was 300 miles away chasing a band of cattle thieves through the Guadalupe Mountains when the letter reached him, delayed by weeks in the slow mail system of the frontier, and he read the news standing beside his horse in a canyon that smelled of piñon smoke, his hands shaking so badly he had to sit down on a rock before he could finish reading Nora's words. "He never stopped believing you would clear his name," Nora had written, her handwriting blotted in places where her tears must have fallen upon the page. "He told me near the end that he was not afraid to die, only afraid that the world would remember him as a murderer instead of the innocent man he was. Phineas, I do not know how to bear this alone." Phineas requested leave from his company that very day, though Captain Doyle could ill afford to lose him with the thieves still at large, and he rode for 6 days straight, stopping only to rest his horse, until he reached Larkspur and found Nora sitting in the small room behind Mrs. Colby's shop, dressed in black, her eyes hollow with grief. He did not say anything clever or comforting when he arrived. He simply knelt beside her chair and took her hands in his, and let her cry against his shoulder for the father she had lost to a lie that still had not been undone. "I am going to finish this," Phineas told her that night, his voice low and rough with his own grief, for he had loved Samuel Graves too, in his way, as the man who had first taught him to read brands and mend fences and hold his tongue until the right moment came to speak. "I swear to you, Nora, on your father's memory, I will not rest until Sela's marrow answers for what he did, and until your father's name is cleared before every soul in this territory." "It will not bring him back," Nora said quietly. "No," Phineas agreed, "but it will mean he did not die for nothing, and it will mean you can walk through this town again without every whisper reminding you of a lie." Nora looked up at him then, her face pale in the lamplight, and for the first time in years, Phineas saw something other than grief in her eyes. He saw the same fierce resolve that had made her rise to her feet in that courtroom a decade before, refusing to accept an injustice the whole town had been too afraid to name. "Then I am coming with you," she said. "Whatever it takes. I am done being the girl who waits in the corner while men decide the truth. I want to help you finish this, Phineas." He wanted to refuse her, to keep her safe and far from the danger such a hunt might bring, but he saw in her face that arguing would be its own kind of injustice, denying her the very agency her father's murder trial had stolen from her family. So instead he nodded, and something passed between them in that quiet room, an understanding that they would face whatever came together, not as a ranger and a grieving daughter, but as two people bound by love and purpose in equal measure. The next 4 years were the hardest and, in their strange way, the sweetest of Phineas Wallace's life. He resigned his commission with the Texas Rangers, for the work he now intended to do required a patience and a discretion that a lawman's badge could not always provide, and instead he took up work as a private investigator and occasional bounty hunter, a trade that let him travel where he pleased and ask the questions he needed answered without drawing the attention that an official inquiry might have brought down upon him from Judge Thorne's allies. Nora, for her part, refused to be left behind in Larkspur waiting on letters that might never come. She used the small savings she had built through years of careful dressmaking to travel with Phineas when she could, and when she could not, she wrote letters to courthouses and newspapers across the territory, asking after old records, old witnesses, old rumors, using the polite, patient persistence of a young woman that few men thought to suspect of digging into a decade-old murder. It was Nora, in fact, who found the first true thread that would unravel Sela's Marrow's carefully built lie. In the autumn of 1883, while going through old newspapers at the Territorial Library in Austin, searching for any mention of Jedediah Cole's murder, Nora discovered a small item from a Santa Fe newspaper, dated some years before, reporting that a man named Cassius Boone had been arrested for drunken brawling, and in his confession to the local sheriff, had rambled about blood money from Texas and a rich man's secrets before sobering up and refusing to say more. The sheriff, uninterested in an out-of-territory matter, had released him after a night in the cell, and the item had been buried on the back page, forgotten by everyone except a diligent young woman with a reason to remember every scrap of information about Sela's Marrow's past. Nora wrote to Phineas at once, her letter reaching him in Fort Sumner where he had been chasing an entirely different lead. He rode for Santa Fe within the hour of reading it. It took him another 8 months to find Cassius Boone, for the man had moved twice more since the Santa Fe arrest, first to a mining camp in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and then to a small settlement near the Pecos River, where he had taken up work as a blacksmith under a different name. When Phineas finally found him, in the spring of 1884, Boone was a broken man, his hands scarred from years of hard labor, his conscience clearly heavier than the anvils he worked each day. "I wondered when someone would come asking," Boone said, when Phineas finally sat him down in the back room of his smithy, a bottle of whiskey between them that Boone drank from far more than Phineas did. "I have carried this a long time, mister, longer than a man ought to carry anything. Tell me about the night Jedediah Cole died," Phineas said quietly. Boone's hands trembled around his cup. Silas Marrow paid me $300 to say I saw Samuel Graves near Cole's property that night. Told me it would settle an old score. Said Graves was a hard man who deserved what was coming to him anyway for standing in his way on some water deal. I did not know it would mean sending an innocent man to prison, mister, I swear it. I did not think that far ahead. I was young, and $300 was more money than I had ever held in my life. And the truth? Phineas asked, his voice tight with the effort of holding his anger in check. What did you actually see that night? Boone was silent for a long moment, staring into his empty cup. I saw Silas Marrow himself, coming from behind Cole's barn, not an hour before the body was found. He had blood on his sleeve. He told me if I ever spoke a word of it, he would see me hanged for the murder myself, and paid me the $300 to make sure my silence held its shape. It was, at last, the confession Phineas had spent 9 years chasing across 3 territories. But Boone's word alone, spoken in a blacksmith's back room, would not be enough to reopen a case that Judge Thorne himself had already closed once with his own gavel. Phineas needed Boone to testify formally before witnesses, and he needed something more, some physical proof that could not be argued away by Marrow's lawyers or Thorne's stubborn pride. "Will you come with me?" Phineas asked. "Will you tell this to a proper court, under oath, and let the truth finally do what it should have done 10 years ago?" Boone was quiet for a long moment, and Phineas thought he might refuse, might vanish again into some other territory before morning. But then the blacksmith looked up, his eyes wet with a decade of guilt finally finding release. "I have a daughter now," Boone said, 6 years old. "I do not want her growing up thinking her father was the kind of man who let an innocent soul rot in prison for money. Yes, I will come. God help me, I will come and tell it all." Phineas sent word to Nora that very night, his hands shaking with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Hope, real and solid, the kind that could finally be held instead of merely chased. Nora met them in Larkspur 3 weeks later, having spent the intervening time quietly gathering what other evidence she could. She had found the county clerk's original inventory of items collected from the scene of Jedediah Cole's murder, a dusty ledger nearly forgotten in the courthouse archive, which listed among other things a silver-plated belt buckle of fine make, not matching the accused, a detail that had somehow never been raised at trial, buried perhaps deliberately by a prosecutor more interested in a quick conviction than an honest one. She had also, through careful and patient correspondence, tracked down the original prosecutor from Samuel Graves's trial, a man named Aldous Finch who had long since retired to a quiet ranch outside San Antonio, his conscience apparently no cleaner than Cassius Boone's. When Nora visited him in person, sitting across from him on his porch with the same quiet dignity her father had always carried, Finch finally admitted what he had long suspected but never dared to voice: that Judge Thorne had received a substantial sum from Silas Marrow before the trial, delivered through an intermediary, to ensure a favorable outcome. "I have no proof of the payment itself," Finch admitted, his old eyes unable to meet Nora's gaze. "Only my own suspicion, built over years of watching Thorne rule in Marrow's favor on every matter that came before him. I am sorry, Miss Graves, I should have spoken sooner. I told myself it was not my place, that the law would sort itself out. I was a coward, and your father paid the price for it." "You can still speak now," Nora told him, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. "It is not too late to tell the truth, Mr. Finch. It is never too late for that." Finch agreed at last to testify to what he knew, and with Boone's confession, the county clerk's forgotten ledger, and Finch's account of Thorne's corruption, Phineas and Nora finally possessed the pieces needed to bring the whole rotten structure of the old trial crashing down. But gathering evidence, they both knew, would mean nothing if Silas Marrow simply silenced them before they could bring it before a court. And Marrow, they would soon learn, had not grown careless in his decade of stolen prosperity. He had grown, if anything, more dangerous. Phineas and Nora rode into Larkspur together in the early summer of 1885, 10 years almost to the month since the trial that had shattered the Graves family, and the town had changed in ways both large and small. New buildings had gone up along Main Street. A proper bank now stood where a feed store once had, and the old courthouse had been repainted, its white walls gleaming in the summer sun, as though trying to disguise the injustice that had once been decided within them. Silas Marrow, they learned upon their arrival, had grown even wealthier over the years, having expanded his holdings to include not only the old Graves Ranch but 2 other properties along Cottonwood Creek, and he had recently been discussed as a candidate for territorial office, a prospect that filled Phineas with a cold, hard fury. "He means to become a senator," Phineas said grimly, as he and Nora sat together in the small hotel room they had taken under assumed names, careful not to announce their presence too loudly before they were ready. "A man who murdered another and let an innocent die in prison for it, and he means to help write the very laws of this territory." "Then we cannot fail," Nora said, though Phineas could see the fear beneath her resolve. "Phineas, if he learns we are here before we are ready, before the evidence is secured with the proper authorities, he could destroy it all. He could hurt Boone or Finch or—" She did not finish the thought, but Phineas understood it well enough. Marrow could hurt her. "We will not fail," Phineas said, reaching across the small table to take her hand, an act that had become as natural to them both as breathing over the years of letters and shared purpose. "I did not spend 10 years chasing this truth to lose it now, Nora. And I did not spend 10 years loving you to let anything happen to you before I have the chance to tell you so properly." Nora's breath caught, and for a moment the weight of their long, careful mission seemed to lift, replaced by something softer and more urgent. "You have never said it so plainly before," she said quietly. "I have been saying it in every letter for 9 years," Phineas said. "In every mile I rode toward some new lead, in every night I lay awake wondering if you were safe. I love you, Nora Graves. I have loved you since you stood up in that courtroom and refused to let a lie stand unchallenged. I should have told you plainly long before now." Nora rose from her chair and crossed to him, and this time there was no hesitation in her movement. She took his face in her hands and kissed him, softly at first, and then with the full weight of 10 years of longing finally given permission to speak, and Phineas rose to meet her, his arms wrapping around her as though he might never let go. "I love you too," Nora whispered against his lips. "I think I have loved you since that first night on the porch, when you promised my father's memory would not be forgotten. I was only waiting for the truth to be safe enough to hold alongside it." They held each other for a long while in that small hotel room, the weight of a decade finally settling into something like peace. But the danger that still surrounded them had not vanished simply because their hearts had finally spoken. Marrow remained free and powerful and dangerous, and the work of the following days would test not only their evidence but their courage. The first challenge came 2 days later, when word reached Silas Marrow, through a careless clerk at the courthouse whom Nora had approached about old records, that a ranger-turned-investigator had returned to Larkspur asking questions about the Cole murder. Marrow moved quickly, as men with much to lose often do. That very evening, as Phineas walked back from the telegraph office where he had sent word to the territorial governor's office requesting an independent review of the old trial, 3 men stepped out from the alley beside the Cottonwood Saloon and blocked his path. "Mr. Marrow sends his regards," said the largest of the 3, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his cheek, and a warning that men who dig too deep in other folks' business sometimes find themselves buried in it. Phineas had faced down worse odds during his years with the Rangers, and though his hand moved instinctively toward the revolver at his hip, he kept his voice calm. "You tell Mr. Marrow that the digging is already done. All that remains now is for the truth to be laid before a judge who cannot be bought. Threatening me will not undo 10 years of evidence, gentlemen. It will only add another charge to the ledger he will answer for." The scarred man's jaw tightened, and for a moment Phineas thought violence was unavoidable, but then a voice rang out from the boardwalk behind them. "I would think twice if I were you boys." It was Diego Reyes, the vaquero friend Phineas had made years before during his ranger days, who had ridden into Larkspur only that morning at Phineas's request, bringing with him two other former rangers who owed Phineas their lives from old battles along the Red River. The three men, now outnumbered and facing former lawmen with nothing to lose, backed away with muttered curses, though the scarred man paused at the mouth of the alley to deliver one final warning. "This is not finished," he said. "No," Phineas agreed quietly. "It is not, but it will finish soon and not in the way Mr. Marrow hopes." Nora, waiting anxiously at the hotel, embraced Phineas fiercely when he returned and told her what had happened, her fear for his safety mixing with a fierce pride at how he had held his ground without resorting to the violence Marrow's men had clearly hoped to provoke. "We need to move faster," Phineas told her. "If Marrow is already sending men to threaten us, he will not wait long before trying something more permanent. We need the territorial authorities involved before he can silence Boone or Finch, or do something worse." It took another week of careful maneuvering, but Phineas's letter to the territorial governor's office, combined with a separate letter from a respected ranger captain vouching for Phineas's character and the seriousness of the evidence, finally produced results. A special territorial judge, a stern but fair-minded man named Judge Cornelius Abernathy, was dispatched to Larkspur to review the case, with strict instructions that Judge Thorne himself was to have no involvement in the proceedings given the serious allegations against him. The hearing, when it finally came, drew nearly the entire town of Larkspur into the same courthouse where Samuel Graves had been condemned a decade before. Nora sat in the front row once more, though this time Phineas sat beside her, his hand steady in hers, and this time it was Silas Marrow who sat pale and sweating at the defendant's table, his fine suits and confident smile doing nothing to hide the fear now etched plainly across his face. Cassius Boone testified first, his voice trembling but clear as he recounted the night he had seen Silas Marrow emerge from behind Jedediah Cole's barn with blood on his sleeve, and the $300 paid to buy his false testimony against an innocent man. Marrow's lawyer objected repeatedly, but Judge Abernathy, unmoved by the objections, allowed the testimony to stand, noting dryly that a court which had once ignored inconvenient evidence would not do so again under his watch. Aldous Finch followed, his old voice heavy with a decade of regret, describing the substantial payment he suspected Judge Thorne had received before Samuel Graves's original trial, delivered through an intermediary whose name he had since confirmed through careful inquiry, a lawyer in Marrow's employ named Willis Grady, who, when subpoenaed, broke down under questioning and admitted the full scheme, hoping for leniency in exchange for his own testimony against the man who had once been his employer. Finally, Nora herself took the stand, and though her voice shook at first, it grew steadier with every word, as she described her father's quiet dignity through the years of his imprisonment, his refusal to abandon hope even as his health failed, and his death in a cold cell for a crime he had never committed. She held up the county clerk's forgotten ledger, entering it into evidence, its faded ink listing a silver-plated belt buckle that had never once been raised at the original trial, a buckle that matched the very set Silas Marrow was known to wear. "My father died believing that justice was a thing reserved for men with money and standing," Nora said, her eyes fixed on Silas Marrow across the courtroom. "I'm here today to prove that even after 10 years, even after everything you took from us, the truth can still find its way home." The courtroom was silent as she stepped down from the stand, and when Judge Abernathy called for a recess to consider the evidence, Silas Marrow's lawyer leaned over to whisper something urgent in his client's ear. Marrow's face had gone the color of old ash. When the court reconvened 2 hours later, Judge Abernathy did not mince words. "This court finds overwhelming evidence that Silas Marrow murdered Jedediah Cole, and further finds that he conspired with then-presiding Judge Elias Thorne to secure a wrongful conviction against Samuel Graves, an innocent man who subsequently died while unjustly imprisoned. This court orders the immediate arrest of Silas Marrow on charges of murder and conspiracy, and further orders that Judge Elias Thorne be removed from the bench and referred to the Territorial Attorney General for criminal prosecution on charges of accepting bribes and obstruction of justice. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of gasps and murmurs, and Phineas watched as two deputies, newly appointed by the territorial government and thus untouched by Marrow's old influence, moved forward to place Silas Marrow in irons, the same irons, Phineas could not help but think, that should have bound him a decade before. "This is not over," Marrow spat, as the deputies led him from the courtroom. "I have friends in this territory who will not stand for this." "Perhaps," Judge Abernathy replied calmly from the bench. "But friends bought with dirty money rarely stay loyal once that money runs dry, Mr. Marrow. I suspect you will find yourself with considerably fewer friends by the time your trial concludes." Judge Abernathy's final act that day was perhaps the one that meant the most to Nora Graves. He ordered the court records amended to reflect the full exoneration of Samuel Graves, posthumously clearing his name of all charges related to the murder of Jedediah Cole, and further ordered that the ranch along Cottonwood Creek, illegally acquired by Silas Marrow through predatory debt manipulation following the wrongful conviction, be returned in full to Nora Graves as the rightful heir of her father's estate. Nora broke down weeping when the ruling was read aloud, and Phineas held her as the tears finally came, 10 years of grief and fear and hope all pouring out at once in the very courtroom where her family's suffering had begun. Around them, the townspeople who had once watched in silence as an innocent man was condemned now rose in a slow, spreading applause, some of them, Phineas noted, wiping away tears of their own, whether from shame at their own silence a decade before or simple relief that the truth had finally won out. He could not say, and perhaps it did not matter. "It is done," Phineas murmured into Nora's hair as he held her. "Your father's name is clear, Nora. The world knows the truth now. Because of you," Nora said, pulling back to look at him, her face wet with tears but shining with something that looked almost like joy. 10 years, Phineas. You gave 10 years of your life to this." "I gave 10 years of my life to you," Phineas corrected gently. "The truth was always going to matter, but I do not know that I would have chased it so far or so long if it had not led back to you every single time." Silas Marrow's trial, when it came a month later, was swift and thorough, the weight of evidence too great for even his considerable wealth to overcome. He was convicted of the murder of Jedediah Cole and sentenced to hang, a sentence carried out that autumn before a crowd that included, though she chose to stand at the very back and did not watch the final moment, Nora Graves herself, who had come only to see justice finally, truly done, not to witness a man's death for its own sake. Judge Elias Thorne fared little better. Stripped of his position and facing his own criminal trial for accepting bribes, he was ultimately sentenced to 5 years in the very penitentiary at Huntsville where Samuel Graves had died, a bitter irony that was not lost on anyone in Larkspur. With the legal matters finally resolved, Phineas and Nora returned to the ranch along Cottonwood Creek that had once been her family's pride and had, through the long injustice of the years, become something like a wound upon the landscape itself, its fences fallen, its barn weathered by neglect under Marrow's careless stewardship. But the land itself remained good, the water still ran clear and sweet along the creek bed, and the hills still turned gold at dusk just as Phineas remembered from his youth. "It needs work," Nora said, standing in the overgrown yard where she had once played as a child, her father's laughter still somehow present in the very silence of the place. "I have spent 10 years learning patience," Phineas said, coming to stand beside her, "and I have spent nearly as many learning how to mend fences and raise a good herd. I do not think this ranch is beyond saving, Nora. not with time and care and the right hands to do the work. Nora turned to him, and there was a question in her eyes that needed no words to accompany it. But Phineas answered it anyway, dropping to one knee in the very yard where he had first fallen in love with her a decade before, pulling from his coat pocket a small ring he had carried with him for the better part of a year, waiting for the right moment, a moment he had begun to fear might never come. "Nora Graves," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart, "I have loved you since the day you stood up in that courtroom and refused to let injustice stand unchallenged. I have loved you through 10 years of letters and long roads and every mile that kept us apart. I do not wish to spend another day without you at my side. Will you marry me and help me rebuild this ranch and this life together?" Nora was crying again, though these tears, Phineas could see plainly, held nothing but joy. "Yes," she said, pulling him up to his feet and into her arms before he could even finish rising. "Yes, Phineas Wallace, 1,000 times yes. I have been waiting for you to ask since the moment you rode away from this very yard 10 years ago." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Larkspur, the same church where Nora's mother had once been laid to rest, and where, 10 years before, few would have dared to whisper a kind word about the Graves family for fear of Silas Marrow's displeasure. Now the church was filled nearly to bursting, for the truth of Samuel Graves's innocence had spread through the town like water finding its level, and many who had once looked away now came to offer their blessing, some out of genuine goodwill, others perhaps seeking a measure of forgiveness for their old silence. Nora, in her generous way, welcomed them all. Diego Reyes stood as Phineas's best man, having become as close as a brother to him over their years of shared trials, and he raised his glass at the small celebration that followed with words that made the whole gathering laugh through their tears. 10 years I have watched this man chase ghosts and rumors and bad leads across 3 territories, Diego said, and I confess there were nights I thought he had lost his mind entirely, chasing a case everyone else had long since forgotten. But I have never seen a man's patience rewarded so justly, nor a love so plainly earned. To Phineas and Nora Wallace, may your years together be as full of joy as the years behind you were full of hardship. The ranch along Cottonwood Creek slowly returned to life under their care over the following seasons. Phineas brought in a small but healthy herd of longhorns, using the last of his savings from his years as a ranger and investigator, and Diego Reyes, having grown tired of the wandering life, agreed to stay on as foreman, bringing with him a skill for cattle work that quickly made the Wallace Ranch one of the more respected operations along the creek. Nora continued her dressmaking for a time, though as the ranch grew more prosperous, she found herself drawn increasingly to the schoolhouse in town, where she began teaching the younger children of Larkspur, determined that no child in that town would grow up believing, as she once had, that justice belonged only to those with money and standing. In the spring of 1887, nearly 2 years after their wedding, Nora gave birth to their first child, a son, whom they named Samuel, after the grandfather he would never meet but whose memory his parents made certain he would grow up knowing well, through stories told by lamplight and a small portrait of Samuel Graves that hung above the mantel in the ranch house Phineas had rebuilt with his own hands. 2 years after that, a daughter followed, whom they named Catherine, after Nora's late mother, and the ranch house that had once stood empty and neglected under Silas Marrow's careless ownership now rang with the sound of children's laughter, a sound that Phineas, watching his family grow, thought must surely be the sweetest justice of all. They did not forget the others who had helped bring the truth to light. Cassius Boone, whose late confession had finally set the whole matter in motion, received a portion of the reward money that the territorial government eventually paid out for information leading to Marrow's conviction, enough to secure a small piece of land near the Pecos River, where he raised his daughter with a clean conscience at last. Aldous Finch lived out his remaining years on his ranch outside San Antonio, and though he never fully forgave himself for his early silence, he found some measure of peace in knowing he had finally told the truth when it mattered most. And he corresponded with Nora until his death some years later, a quiet friendship built on the shared understanding of what it cost and what it was worth to finally speak. On summer evenings, when the work of the ranch was done and the children had been put to bed, Phineas and Nora often sat together on the same porch where he had first promised her, 10 years before their wedding, that he would not rest until the truth was known. The creek still ran clear and sweet below the house, the hills still turned gold at dusk, and though the scars of the past never fully faded, for grief of that depth does not simply vanish with the passing of years, they had built something enduring in its place, a home filled with love, a name fully restored, and a partnership forged not merely in romance but in the long, hard work of seeking justice together. "Do you ever think about how different it might have been?" Nora asked him one such evening, some years into their marriage, as she leaned against his shoulder and watched their son chase fireflies in the yard below. "If you had never spoken up that day in the courtroom, if you had simply looked away like everyone else." Phineas considered the question for a long moment, his arm tightening around her. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted, "but I do not think I ever truly could have looked away, Nora. Not after I saw you stand up and refuse to be silent. You taught me that day that some things are worth the risk of speaking, no matter the cost. I have simply spent every year since trying to be worthy of that lesson." "You succeeded," Nora said softly, turning her face up to kiss him. "More than you know." Below them in the yard, their son's laughter rang out clear and bright against the deepening blue of the evening sky, and somewhere beyond the hills, the last light of the sun caught the surface of Cottonwood Creek and turned it briefly to gold, the same gold Phineas remembered from the evening 10 years before when he had first promised a grieving young woman that her father's memory would not be forgotten, and that whatever it took, however long the road, he would not rest until the truth came home. He had kept that promise in the end with everything he had, and in the keeping of it, he had found not only justice for a man long wronged, but a love that had grown steady and true across every mile of the long road that brought them at last home.